The first-class cabin glimmered with muted elegance. Soft, beige leather, polished wood panels, the low hum of the engines filling every silence. But for Isabella Hart, silence was the one luxury she couldn't buy tonight. Her son, Noah, was cradled tightly in her arms, his tiny fists clenched, his face flushed crimson as his wails rose above the steady drone of the plane. It was the kind of crying that didn't just echo, it pierced, sharp and unrelenting. Isabella rocked him, her perfectly manicured hands trembling, whispering soothing words she had read from parenting blogs but never truly mastered. It wasn't working. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A businessman 2 rows ahead let out a long, irritated sigh. A woman across the aisle pressed her earbuds in deeper, eyes narrowing with impatience. Even the flight attendants, polite smiles stretched thin, offered her warm napkins, gentle suggestions, but no solution. Isabella's chest tightened. For a woman who had stared down Wall Street giants, who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers before she turned 30, this helplessness felt foreign. She wasn't supposed to fail. Not here. Not like this. Her reflection flickered faintly against the window beside her. A 32-year-old CEO in a navy blazer, her dark hair swept into a polished knot, her reputation wrapped in steel. Yet here, with her son screaming against her shoulder, she didn't see a powerhouse. She saw a woman fraying at the edges. Noah's cries grew louder. Isabella's heart raced faster. She bounced him, shifted him, whispered again. Nothing. Each second stretched like an eternity. The whispers grew sharper now, not even masked. She should have stayed home. Some people just don't know how to handle a baby. The sting of judgment pressed harder than any hostile takeover she had ever faced. Her throat tightened, eyes burning with the humiliation of it all. And then, from the back of the cabin, there was movement. A man rose quietly, careful not to draw attention, though the space seemed to make room for him anyway. Tall, broad-shouldered but softened by gentleness in his step, he walked slowly down the aisle. His clothes were casual, travel-worn, but his presence carried something steadier than polish, something unshakable. He paused a few feet away, offering no intrusion, no judgment, just a calm, steady voice. "Would you like some help?" Isabella blinked at him. Her instinct bristled. She didn't hand over control, not in business, not in life. But Noah's cries shredded her resistance, leaving only exhaustion. She looked at him fully now. His eyes were kind, framed with the weight of someone who had weathered storms of his own. Daniel Hayes, 34, a stranger yet not threatening. His daughter, a little girl with auburn curls and curious eyes, peeked from behind his seat, watching quietly. For a moment, Isabella hesitated. Every instinct told her she could manage on her own, that she should manage. But as Noah's tiny body convulsed with sobs against her chest, she felt something crack inside her. With trembling hands, she let the man extend his arms. Daniel moved gently as though the baby were made of glass, and within seconds Noah was resting in his embrace. Daniel's voice lowered into a soft hum, almost a lullaby, steady and practiced. And just like that, Noah began to quiet. The cabin stilled. The whispers stopped. Passengers shifted, no longer in irritation but in surprise. Even the flight attendant paused mid-step, watching in silence. Isabella's breath caught. Her heart pounded, not just from relief but from the strange, unfamiliar sight of someone else holding her son, soothing him with an ease she couldn't summon. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or shame or something deeper she couldn't yet name. But in that moment, high above the clouds, Isabella Hart, the woman who had built walls out of steel and glass, felt the first crack in her armor. And Daniel Hayes, a man who carried his own scars quietly, had stepped through without even trying. The hum of the engine seemed softer now, almost as if the plane itself was listening. In Daniel Hayes's arms, Noah gave one last shaky whimper before surrendering to calm. His tiny chest rose and fell in rhythm with the low, steady vibrations of Daniel's voice, a song that wasn't so much a melody as it was comfort, born from years of practice no one had ever seen. Passengers who had moments earlier been ready to complain now sat stunned, their irritation swallowed by the strange tenderness unfolding before them. A few even smiled, quietly ashamed of their impatience. The atmosphere, once brittle with judgment, had shifted into something else, something heavier but kinder. Isabella sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Relief flooded her, but so did something far more dangerous: vulnerability. She wasn't used to watching someone succeed where she failed. She wasn't used to needing anyone. Her eyes lingered on Daniel, his unshaven jaw, his travel-worn hoodie, his sleeves pushed to his forearms as he cradled Noah with a quiet authority that boardrooms could never teach. There was no performance, no need to impress, just a man who knew how to hold a child as if it were second nature. And then, almost unnoticed, came a soft presence. Sophie Hayes, 7 years old, her curls falling into her curious brown eyes, slipped from her seat and padded gently down the aisle. She stopped near Isabella, hesitant but brave enough to speak. "Babies cry a lot when their ears hurt," she said matter-of-factly, her voice carrying the blunt honesty only children could wield. "Daddy always makes me chew gum." "But I don't think babies can chew gum." For the first time since boarding, Isabella laughed. Not a polished, controlled laugh meant for shareholders or reporters, an unguarded one, soft and cracked at the edges. She pressed a hand to her temple, shaking her head slightly. "You're right," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I don't think he's ready for gum yet." Sophie smiled, satisfied with her contribution, before climbing back into her seat. But the moment lingered, an uninvited warmth filling the hollow ache in Isabella's chest. Daniel returned to her row, careful, unhurried. He didn't sit beside her. He didn't intrude. He simply bent down, holding Noah as if returning something precious. "He's just tired," Daniel said softly, almost apologetic, as though he had borrowed her son too long. "Sometimes. They just need arms that aren't shaking." The words struck deeper than he intended. Isabella's lips parted, but no sound came. Arms that aren't shaking. He couldn't have known, but he had somehow seen straight through her. With gentle hands, she took Noah back, the baby now quiet against her chest. She whispered a "thank you," though her voice trembled with more than gratitude. Daniel only nodded, returning to his seat with Sophie. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seek acknowledgement. He simply settled, pulling a book from his bag, his daughter leaning against him with the ease of a child who trusted her world completely. Isabella sat frozen. For years, she had lived in skyscrapers built of glass and ambition. She had carved her life into clean lines, no weakness, no cracks, no dependence. But here, in this narrow cabin above the clouds, a stranger had seen her falter. And instead of judging her, he had simply reached out. No one in her life had ever done that without an agenda. She looked down at Noah, sleeping now, his tiny hand curled against her chest. For the first time since his birth, she didn't feel entirely alone. The thought scared her almost as much as it comforted her. Outside, the sky stretched endless and dark, stars scattered like diamonds against velvet. The flight would be long, but Isabella's sense of time had already shifted. Because tonight, in a place where strangers kept their distance, she had met someone who didn't, and it unsettled her more than she could admit. The hours of a red-eye flight always held a strange rhythm, time both stilled and stretched, measured not by clocks but by the dimming of cabin lights, the slow shift of weary passengers settling into uneasy dreams. For most, this was the part of the journey where silence returned. But for Isabella Hart, silence had never felt so loud. Noah slept soundly now, nestled against her chest, his small breaths warming the silk of her blouse. Every so often, she would glance sideways toward the man who had stilled the storm she could not. Daniel Hayes sat a few rows back with Sophie, his frame angled slightly as if protecting the girl even in sleep. His book lay forgotten in his lap, his eyes half closed, but the weariness in his posture carried a different weight than simple travel fatigue. Isabella wasn't used to curiosity about strangers. In her world, people were either competitors, allies, or irrelevant. But something about him tugged at the cracks she worked so hard to conceal. She shifted Noah gently, then rose from her seat. Stretching under the pretense of movement, she walked slowly toward the back, her gaze landing, almost inevitably, on Daniel. He noticed her before she spoke. His eyes softened, the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had already seen her at her lowest and chosen not to wield it against her. "Thank you," Isabella said, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "I don't usually let anyone help." Daniel studied her for a moment. His reply came low, steady. "Most people don't, especially people who think they have to carry everything alone." Her breath caught. The accuracy of it unsettled her. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." Daniel gave the faintest smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, gaze drifting toward Sophie, whose head rested against the window. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. Sophie was 4. Babies. Children. They don't stop needing you, even when you feel like you're breaking. You figure it out, one night at a time." The simplicity of his words carried a weight Isabella hadn't expected. Grief was something she understood, though hers wore a different face. She had lost her partner too, not to death, but to abandonment. The man who had sworn forever had left the moment responsibility arrived. And since then, she had convinced herself she didn't need anyone, couldn't trust anyone, but Daniel's honesty chipped at that belief. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her throat tightening. He shook his head softly. "Don't be. You learn to build a new kind of life. Different, not worse. Sophie. She saved me as much as I saved her." His gaze flicked to Noah, still nestled against Isabella's shoulder. "He'll do the same for you, if you let him." Her eyes stung, though she blinked quickly, unwilling to show the full depth of her unraveling. She cleared her throat, clutching Noah closer as though shielding herself from the truth in Daniel's words. "Does it get easier?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "No, but you get stronger, and one day you realize the moments that once felt impossible are the ones that make you whole again." For a long beat, Isabella couldn't speak. She only nodded, the lump in her throat too sharp to swallow. The announcement of turbulence broke the fragile quiet. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the cabin rattled with sudden movement. Isabella steadied herself against the overhead bin, instinctively tightening her grip on Noah. Her pulse quickened, her nerves frayed again. Daniel's hand reached out, not touching, just steadying the air between them, an unspoken reassurance. His presence grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. When the plane steadied, she sank back into her seat, her mind racing faster than the engines. She had built her entire life on control, on never needing, on never trusting. And yet tonight, 30,000 feet above the ground, a stranger had given her something no deal, no contract, no empire ever could. The reminder that she wasn't as alone as she thought, and that terrified her more than any boardroom ever had. The plane rocked again, a low groan echoing through the cabin as it sliced through unsettled air. Overhead, bins rattled. A glass clinked sharply somewhere in first class. Passengers stiffened in their seats, eyes darting, but the flight attendants moved calmly, their practiced composure keeping panic at bay. Isabella tightened her hold on Noah, her pulse hammering. His eyes fluttered open, confusion edging toward another cry. She rocked him gently, whispering words she didn't quite believe herself. Across the aisle, Sophie stirred awake. Her small body straightened, her wide brown eyes scanning for her father first. Daniel leaned close, brushing a curl from her forehead. "It's all right, sweetheart." Just a few bumps, but Sophie wasn't looking at the turbulence anymore. She was staring at Isabella, the tense shoulders, the tight jaw, the baby clutched too firmly. For all her 7 years, Sophie's gaze carried something startlingly clear. Recognition. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve. She looked scared. Daniel followed her eyes, his own expression softening. He had seen that look before. On himself, in mirrors he once avoided. Slowly, he unbuckled his belt, rising despite the warning light. The attendants shot him a look, but he moved with a calm assurance that seemed to quiet even them. He crouched beside Isabella's seat, his voice low, steady. "You're safe. The plane can handle more than this. Just breathe with him." Isabella blinked, her chest tight, words stuck somewhere between pride and panic. "I don't like not being in control," she confessed before she could stop herself. Daniel's lips curved faintly, but his tone carried no judgment. "Control's a funny thing. Sometimes the strongest choice is letting go, just for a moment." She stared at him, searching his face for arrogance, pity, anything she had come to expect from people who saw her falter. But all she found was sincerity, and that was somehow worse, because it stripped away her excuses. Noah whimpered again, restless from the shaking. Without asking this time, Daniel reached to steady the baby's blanket, his hand brushing Isabella's lightly. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it sent a strange warmth through her chest. Foreign, unwelcome, but undeniable. Sophie, still watching, tilted her head. "You're good at holding babies, Daddy," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. Then she turned to Isabella with the kind of blunt honesty only a child could offer. "He's good at helping moms, too." Heat rose to Isabella's cheeks. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss it, but the truth in Sophie's eyes pinned her. This little girl, untouched by filters or facades, had seen something she herself was trying desperately to ignore. Daniel gave his daughter a gentle look, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "That's enough, Sophie." But Isabella couldn't shake the child's words. Helping moms. The phrase lingered, pressing against places in her heart she had locked shut. The turbulence eased, the plane leveling once more. The cabin drifted back into uneasy calm, passengers settling. Yet inside Isabella, a storm still churned. She glanced at Daniel, who had returned to his seat, Sophie now tucked against him once more. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't asking anything of her. He simply sat there, a man and his daughter, as though the world hadn't just shifted. And maybe that was what unsettled her most. He hadn't tried to take anything. He had only given steady arms for Noah, quiet reassurance for her, a brief anchor in a sky that refused to stop trembling. For years, Isabella Hart had lived as though she needed no one. Tonight, 30,000 feet above the earth, she wasn't sure she could believe that anymore. The cabin had grown hushed, blanketed in the dim glow of night mode lights. Most passengers had surrendered to restless sleep, their faces softened by exhaustion. Somewhere up front, a soft snore broke the quiet rhythm of the engines. The world outside the windows was endless black, punctured by faint pinpricks of stars. Isabella sat awake, Noah resting peacefully against her chest. His warmth was an anchor, his tiny breaths steady as a heartbeat. Yet her mind refused to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment Daniel had quieted him, the ease in his arms, the words he'd spoken about strength and letting go, words that had struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She turned slightly in her seat and found her gaze drifting again toward him. Daniel wasn't asleep. He sat upright, the book still open in his hands, though his eyes weren't moving across the page. Sophie slept curled against him, her head on his arm. The tenderness in his stillness, the patience of a man who had carried far too much alone, drew Isabella in like gravity. For reasons she couldn't explain, she rose. Her steps were soundless against the narrow aisle, careful not to disturb Noah. When she reached Daniel's row, he looked up, unsurprised, as though he had been waiting. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head, a tired smile flickering. "My brain doesn't know how to turn off." He gestured to the empty space beside him. "Sit. At least your arms will get a break." She hesitated, her instinct to decline rising like muscle memory. But she lowered herself into the seat anyway. Noah nestled safely between them. For the first time all night, her shoulders eased. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was companionable, rare. It was Sophie's soft breathing, the muted rumble of engines, Noah's sighs as he shifted in his sleep. Finally, Isabella broke it. "Do you ever wonder if you're enough for them?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at his daughter, smoothing her curls with a hand roughened by a life that hadn't gone as planned. "Every day," he admitted quietly. "When my wife died, I thought Sophie deserved someone better, someone whole. But then I realized, children don't need perfect, they just need present. They need love, even when it's messy." Isabella's throat tightened. She traced a finger gently over Noah's blanket, afraid her voice would falter. "Noah's father left before he was born. He said I chose my career over him. Maybe he was right. I built this life where I'm supposed to be unshakable. And now, I can't even calm my own baby." Her words cracked in the dark, sharper than she intended. She hated how small they sounded, how much truth bled through. But Daniel didn't look at her with pity, only understanding. "You're not failing," he said simply. "You're learning. That's all any of us are doing." His certainty unnerved her. She wanted to argue, to pull her walls back up, but instead she let the silence stretch, because the weight in her chest felt lighter just sitting here beside him. Daniel leaned back, his voice lower, gentler. "You know, when Sophie was a baby, I used to walk the halls all night with her. I thought if she cried, it meant I was doing something wrong. But then, I realized babies don't cry to test us. They cry because it's the only way they know how to say they need us." Isabella glanced down at Noah, sleeping soundly between them, his tiny fist curled near his cheek. She had been so focused on doing everything right, feeding schedules, books, techniques, that she hadn't considered the simplicity of just being there. The cabin lights dimmed further, the world narrowing to the small circle of warmth between the four of them. Sophie shifted in her sleep, her hand brushing against Isabella's arm. For reasons she couldn't explain, the touch felt like an invitation, like a door cracking open where she thought only walls stood. Isabella exhaled slowly, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since Noah's birth, she didn't feel like she was failing. She felt human. Imperfect, yes, but not alone. Daniel turned his head toward her, his eyes catching the faintest glow of the overhead light. "You're stronger than you think," he said, almost a whisper. And though Isabella had heard variations of that phrase countless times before, from colleagues, rivals, men who mistook her ambition for armor, this was the first time she believed it. The first rays of morning crept through the cabin windows, soft and golden, painting streaks of light across sleeping faces. The endless night gave way to dawn, the kind of fragile beauty that always felt like a promise. Isabella stirred, blinking into the glow. She realized with a start that her head had tilted slightly, resting against the edge of Daniel's shoulder. Noah was still cradled safely in her arms, his tiny breaths deep and steady. Sophie slept curled across her father's lap, her curls tangled but peaceful. For a moment, Isabella didn't move. She just sat there, listening to the hum of the engines, feeling the warmth of two strangers who somehow no longer felt like strangers. The captain's voice broke the spell, announcing their descent. The cabin stirred awake. Seatbelts clicked, Murmurs returned, the quiet cocoon of night unraveling. Isabella straightened quickly, adjusting Noah's blanket, smoothing her hair as if slipping her armor back into place. Old habits rose fast, the need to look composed, but something inside her resisted. The walls she usually rebuilt so easily now felt heavier, harder to lift. Daniel glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence carried understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them in the dark hours above the world. As the plane descended, Sophie blinked awake. She rubbed her eyes, then beamed sleepily at Isabella. "Your baby didn't cry anymore," she said proudly, as though she had been part of the victory. Isabella's lips curved despite herself. "No, he didn't." Thanks to your dad, Sophie tilted her head, studying Isabella with that unfiltered honesty again. "He helps people, but he doesn't let people help him." Daniel chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Go easy on me, kiddo." But the words lingered, an echo Isabella carried as the wheels touched down. The landing was smooth, the cabin filled with the usual rush, passengers unbuckling too early, flight attendants repeating announcements, the shuffle of bags from overhead bins. Chaos returned, but Isabella felt oddly still inside it. She rose carefully, Noah against her chest, her bag balanced on her shoulder. For the first time since boarding, she didn't feel the weight as heavily. Daniel helped Sophie with her little backpack, his hand steady on her small shoulder. When Isabella hesitated in the aisle, he met her eyes. There was no expectation there, no pressure, just quiet possibility. "Take care of yourself," he said gently. She swallowed, the words she wanted to say tangled in her throat. "Don't disappear. Don't let this end here." But fear and pride kept her silent. They moved with the tide of passengers, spilling into the brightness of the terminal. Families reunited, business people hurried off, voices rose in every direction. For a moment, Isabella thought this was where it ended, where two paths, briefly crossing in the night sky, split back into separate lives. But then Sophie tugged her father's hand and ran ahead toward Isabella, fearless as ever. "Will we see you again?" she asked, her eyes wide, her voice carrying the innocence of hope. Isabella froze. Daniel caught up, his expression unreadable but his silence giving her room to answer. She glanced at Noah, then at Sophie, then finally at Daniel. "Maybe we should," Isabella said softly. "Maybe we're not meant to do all of this alone." The words surprised her as much as him, but once spoken, they felt right, like the first step onto solid ground after years of balancing on glass. Daniel's smile was small, almost cautious, but it reached his eyes this time. He nodded. "Then maybe we should." And just like that, in the middle of a crowded airport, the world seemed to still. Not because everything was solved, not because grief or fear had vanished, but because two broken hearts had recognized each other. For Isabella Hart, the woman who thought strength meant never needing anyone, and for Daniel Hayes, the man who thought love ended with loss, this was not the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something unexpected. A second chance. A family not born of perfection, but of love. And as the morning sun flooded through the glass of the terminal, painting them in light, Isabella realized that sometimes the strongest deals aren't made in boardrooms. They're made in the quiet promise of strangers who choose not to stay strangers.